Hello, this is going to be an English language paper 2 walkthrough of the 2017 paper. I'm going to be doing paragraph structure and telling you what is expected from you with each question and how many paragraphs you should be doing, and just the aims and AO1, AO2, AO3 and all of that stuff that you should be addressing when answering the questions. So this question is really not the hardest of them all. I don't think you should be struggling with this personally. But if you are, then I think you need to work on just generally reading, because it's only just reading and understanding this question. It shouldn't be something you are struggling with, and it's only 4 marks. So if you are really struggling, then you are only missing out on 4 marks, but it can be a difference between a grade and another grade. So you should focus on just being able to address this if you cannot do it. But it is okay to skip and come back to at the end, which I personally have done if it's not been clear to me the answer. And after doing almost an hour of exam work, you will be able to understand it more clearly after being in that English language mindset for an hour. So trust me, this isn't something you should be stressing about, because there are much harder questions in this paper. So now we're going to be doing question 2, which you need to use both sources for. It is very explicit, it's in big bold black writing, so if you don't include both of them, you will obviously be capped, because it is very clear you should be using them. And in this question, you are looking specifically at the differences between the behaviour of the children in the 2 schools. Obviously, straight away, you know what you're talking about, differences between children at the schools. Very clear. Could also be similarities though, so maybe watch out for that, because it will be 50-50. Obviously, similarities, differences, very easy to talk about. Then firstly, you start with stating the difference, which is directly responding to the question, and the examiners want you to do this because it shows you're directly addressing what they're asking you. Very important, definitely should be included. So one difference between A and B, could talk about the atmosphere, very important, can be talked about with pretty much every question, because it's a very clear difference when there's a difference in the atmosphere. As you go down, you have to give the evidence for this. So in source A, we learn in source A, it's described as being very standard, definitely needed, because it follows into what you're about to talk about next, which is the suggestions. So this suggests, this broadcast, this reveals. Important because you're talking about its implications and what else you could be learning from this. And finally, as you go to the bottom, you are talking about source B now, and you is using your comparative words like alternatively, conversely, however, on the other hand, all stuff like that. Very important as it joins the next bit together. So in source B we learn, in source A it's described as being. Very different, but you do need to have it because you are comparing the two and talking about what that could mean. So described as being, yep. And then finally you have to give the evidence for this. So that is that, suggesting evidence, and then finally this suggests as broadcast as reveals. Obviously the same you did for that. Very important because you're talking about implications. Again, important, very important. So that is basically all you need to do for question 2. Very simple question. It is 2 paragraphs, and you will need about 1.5 pages of big chunky paragraphs, because these are very detailed, because you're doing comparisons in them. And yeah, that's it for question 2. Now we're going to be going over question 3, which is just using source A from lines 11 to 27. What I like to do is I like to draw a line across and where I should be looking down from. This is something people get wrong all the time, because they will go to use the whole source, because one of the questions in paper 1 they have to do something like that, and they definitely get confused with that. So make sure you are using the correct bit of the source, which is just the standard what you should be doing. So don't get that bit wrong, because you will immediately be marked down for that. So firstly, you need to make a point, because you are responding to the question the examiner is asking. Obviously they're talking about the description of this person. So this person is described as being when they do this. This is just responding to the question, making a point, showing that you're addressing what the examiner wants you to do. And then when you progress down, you see give the evidence, which is obviously what you need to do for most questions, or all of them really. So you say this is clear when whichever writer describes them as being, the writer describes them as evidence to what you're saying. Really important, you need that. And because it's a language question, you should be able to name loads of language devices and know exactly what they are for. And if you don't, then you should try and learn as many as you can in the week you have to learn, or whenever you are watching this, I don't know. But the use of simile, metaphor, alliteration, etc. You can talk about so many here, but make sure you're not talking about structural devices, because they are explicitly asking you to talk about language. So no structure, nothing like that, because you will not get marked for that at all. And obviously after that, you're talking about its effect on the reader. Highlights, symbolizes, reveals, obviously need it, makes the reader think, forces the reader to imagine, very important. And then terminology, zoom in. So furthermore, the use of the language device, anything, simile, metaphor, all of that. And you talk about the development of the imagery, because you are still talking about the language. So you have to talk about what the reader is creating with the language and the impression she is trying to make of, in this case, Sister Brendan. Obviously, this shouldn't be too hard of a question. It's only 12 marks. It's not like you're doing question 5, but this is a very important question, and you should be doing at least 3 paragraphs for this, possibly 4 if you have time. I always aim for at least 3 for though, because this has a lot of marks in it when you think about it compared to the rest of the paper. But yeah, this shouldn't be incredibly hard because you're only using one section of one source, so there's not much that you can go wrong with this. And obviously, because this question is so explicit, there will be loads of language devices in this area. Now we're going to be looking at question 4, which is, I think, the hardest question in the paper for me personally, because you're using the whole of both sources, and that to me is always very daunting, and I really don't enjoy this question. So in the question, it's asking you to use both sources highlighted in bold. Obviously, you know you're going to be doing that, and you are comparing how the writers different attitudes to the 2 schools. Again, 2 schools question shouldn't be too hard. Compare the different attitudes. Obviously, you're going to be highlighting different attitudes. Compare the methods, you know, all of that. Structural, language, methods the writers use to convey their different attitudes, very important. Support your response. The references of both the text, so you know they are explicitly asking you to be using quotes from each text and not coming up with this on your own, because that is not using the text, obviously. And firstly, you're going to start with the comparison between the viewpoints and just the response to the question. So each writer has a different attitude to, in this case, the 2 schools. Both writers have similar viewpoints too. If it's a similarities question, which it can be, different similarities, all can very much likely be on your paper. And after that, you just obviously are giving your evidence, explain the viewpoint, give evidence from source A. In source A, the writer believes as they mention, as they claim. Obviously very important, because you are showing where you're getting it from, which is support your response from the references to the both texts. Very important, because it literally says it right there. That is what you should be doing, so you must include that. Then as you go down, you do your analysing of the terminology and links to viewpoints A, the use of fact, statistics, noun, adjective, reveals, highlights, indicates, exposes, very important. You should very much include, because it is pretty much what it's asking you to do. Compare the methods the writer uses, and these are the methods: fact, statistic. Obviously, you should know what these all are now, because you've been doing it for 2 years. But yeah, if you don't know, then you should Google it and find out, because you will be able to find these very easy after you know what they are. And then you go on to your comparative words. However, on the other hand, alternatively, very important, because you are conjoining it onto the next bit about source B. However, on the other hand, all that, in source B, the writer feels whatever. The writer feels different because it's the different attitudes. The writer has difference. As he states in source B, the writer, the attitude is, you're explaining their viewpoint and giving the evidence for B, because you have this little ellipse there. So you know you're going to be talking about the evidence from B. And then obviously after that you have to analyze it, So the use of fact, statistic, hyperbole, again, reveals and highlights the importance of and exposes. This should be a very big question for you. I'd say at least 2 pages, maybe going on to 2.5, because it is 16 marks. This is the highest piece of your paper that isn't the question 5. Very important question, definitely shouldn't skip. This is the one question you shouldn't skip out of all of them, I'd say, apart from question 5 obviously. But yeah, for this you will be doing 4 paragraphs, possibly 5. I always aim to do 4 though, because 5 can be a little excessive after you've done so many previously. Now finally you're going to go on to question 5, which is the bulk of your marks pretty much. Question 5 and question 4, it makes up 75% of the paper, so if you are going to do any 2 questions, these are definitely the ones that you should be doing. You'll be given a controversial statement, obviously. So here's the statement here: education is not about which school you go to or what qualifications you gain, it's also about what you learn from your experience outside of school. And obviously in this you're doing writing a speech, which you have to think about what kind of things you have to do when you're writing a speech, like addressing an audience, all that kind of stuff, but it will either be speech, article or letter. So you should know exactly what you should write for each 3 things, because these are basic 3 parts of life so you will definitely have encountered before. So it's important to make sure that your examiner knows you are talking about one of these 3 things. So these are 4 things I think are vital to include in any question 5, because they just improve the maturity of your work and make it sound more believable and clever. So the first thing is an anecdote, which is basically just a story. You can make this up for about 1.5 paragraphs. These are very easy things to add, and they make your writing look so much more sophisticated because you're using real life things that are happening. Well, not real, but real in the sense of the question. And the next thing I think you definitely need to include is the research in a recent survey from Make Any Fake Statement You Want from gov.uk. Also you can include stuff like after a study from Cambridge University we can conclude ... whatever. Just using any kind of research makes your work sound so much more sophisticated because it's adding in that extra viewpoint to what you are doing. It doesn't have to be right at all, which you should know already. You are making this up. This isn't accurate at all, but it has to be somewhat accurate. You can't make massively false statements because otherwise it will be so gleamingly incorrect that it just can't make any sense at all. And then you go on to your counter argument. This you absolutely have to use. If you're going to do any of these, you have to add a counter argument, because this is just shows that you can see from 2 different viewpoints. So although some believe, I believe something else. However, we must acknowledge that you are openly admitting that you must acknowledge something. It shows that you are able to contradict your viewpoint but still see what other people are talking about, which is very important for this question, because you are just talking about a whole thing like that. And then obviously the link, how would you feel if, ultimately how would you respond if. This is very important because it's giving the reader something somewhat personal, making them think about their reaction to whatever situation this is. And when you're addressing them directly with direct address, obviously, you know that they will be thinking about that and thinking about what their response would actually be, keeping them more engaged with what you are talking about and more interested ultimately. This you should be doing, I would say, at least 2.5 pages for, because this is 40 marks, 16 marks technical accuracy, which you should be okay with already, because you are not making massively preposterous statements, and 24 marks for content and organisation. Obviously you have to learn how to lay out the speech, article and letter, so you definitely need to learn how to do that, otherwise you will lose points for that. But ultimately this should be where the bulk of your marks is, if they're going to be anywhere, because this is designed to give you all the marks. So you should be spending at least 45 minutes on this. So yeah.